You don't rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of your preparation. And if your business continuity plan is outdated, untested, or non-existent, that's your floor. That's what you're landing on when the unexpected hits. This episode is your emergency wake-up call. What happens when your backup systems fail, when leadership is unreachable, or when the data is gone or the power is out, and you don't have any playbook at all? Let's talk about the continuity plan you wish you had before you needed it. Leadership today isn't just about scaling. It's about navigating constant uncertainty, market disruptions, and high-pressure decisions. If you're dealing with chaos, bottlenecks, and relentless pressure, welcome to the Business Emergency Room. Welcome back to the Business Emergency Room. I'm Maartje van Krieken, and I'm really glad you're here because today we're talking about a tool every business should have, but too few use actually well or at all: the business continuity plan. I do not just believe in the value of having an actual live, updated, or living document and good business continuity plan. What I really believe is that much of its value comes actually from developing it, which is what I want to talk about it today. The truth actually is very sobering. Only about half of all companies have a documented business continuity plan. And of those, only a very small fraction actually keep them current or test them regularly. FEMA presents the sad report that 3 out of 4 companies without a business continuity plan fail within 3 years of a major disruption. And if you're a small business, fewer than 40% reopen after a major event. If your disruption is a data-related disaster, the number is even worse. And almost 95% of companies without a disaster recovery plan after a big data breach are out of business within 12 months. That's insane. So basically, not addressing the issue and not having a plan in place means that if something happened, your chances of going out of business are insane. You can see from that number, the big number around the data breach, that that's probably the reason most business continuity plans are quite limited in scope and typically address cybersecurity and data breaches, IT, stuff like that. Maybe some physical recovery. But in today's volatile and complex and ambiguous and uncertain world, that's not nearly enough. So let's start with a very public case that shows exactly what happens when a continuity plan is missing its key pieces. I have to say, I'd spent many, many hours with clients on business continuity plans or on situations that could have been avoided if business continuity plans were in place. Also safe to say that none of them want me to publicly talk about this because it's embarrassing. And this or it feels embarrassing. I don't think it's embarrassing because the numbers suggest that you're not alone. It's a human thing. We don't want to think about that disaster as a level of events, right? But that doesn't mean that they don't happen. And so the case study I want to talk about ultimately was also very embarrassing because it's about Southwest Airlines. For those of you in the US, you may remember that Christmas break or holiday period in 2022 was quite extreme from a weather perspective. And as a result, families across North America were flying home for the holidays and got stuck because of weather. And it was bad. So most airlines had issues, but most airlines also dealt with it. And some had temporary chaos, but most were back in working order and had dealt with the backlog in about 48 hours. Southwest Airlines, they had a full system collapse. So they had 16,000 flights canceled. They had stranded crews, and not just a little. Over 80% of their crews were in the wrong place to actually get moving again. They had all these passengers sleeping on airport floors because there was no accommodation. And so it wasn't just the weather. This was a failure to plan for failure. If you're an airline, then having a plan for, extreme weather disruption is something you would expect to have. Well, Their crew scheduling software was very outdated, clearly, and couldn't handle the rerouting. There was no manual override, and nobody who had understood the system well enough to go in there and do that. There was no tested backup, and there was no playbook. And it was like as if they didn't see it coming. They had years of record profits. At that point, they were doing actually very well. But what happened is that it cost them 800 million. The loss in customer trust is potentially immeasurable, but it can still be felt. They didn't necessarily come back from that at all yet. And if anything, maybe have slipped down further with some subsequent events. The lesson is that a business continuity plan that doesn't cover system-wide operational risk is not really a continuity plan. So let's start with the basics briefly. What are actually the things that should be in a business continuity plan, or what are some of the standard elements that most of you will have in there, or at least put some time and effort towards? First, the business impact analysis. If something happens, what's the bare minimum in your business that needs to keep running to be functional? And what breaks if the business is disrupted? And that goes the whole gamut, right? From cash flow to people to, if you're a bank, your clients being able to continue to access such. In Southwest case, the inability to reassign crew meant that planes were grounded. So they had material and people stuck in all the right places. And although these different crews could probably fly some of those planes, the system wouldn't allow them to reallocate people to actually make that happen. So there was no flexibility to go in and override that. That single function was the Achilles heel of it all. Then what needs to be in your plan is the risk assessment, right? No, you won't predict every scenario. But if you work through plausible disruptions, you'll know how to adapt fast. And some that have high probabilities probably need more work than those with low probabilities. Although if you have risk with low probability of occurrence, but with extreme impact. So if you believe that a 48-hour weather event, which is the weather event in that December 2022 was extreme, right? So if let's call that an extreme weather event, if the likelihood of that extreme weather event happening is low, but the impact is so big, you still want to plan for it because, or have a scenario written up for it, something of a recovery plan, because it's going to make or break your business. So, which brings me to the third element, which is recovering strategies. Now that you know where the potential risks sit, you start talking about, okay, how would we come back from this? How would we build redundancy in the system? What can we set up in advance, like manual overrides, for instance? That didn't exist for that system for Southwest. Then we go to emergency response and crisis communication. This can have very many different phases, right? Because if you're a producing company and you have safety critical equipment, or you provide safety critical or life-saving services to anyone, then this looks very different than if you're a nice to have online service company. So, and if you are a chemical plant, then this probably dovetails into whatever local area emergency response plan exists, and determines whether this is something that you do in-house and all by yourself, or whether you need to tap into other systems here. But the most important thing is, what is the escalation chain if leadership is unavailable? Too often, when something happens in businesses, people say, well, but the big boss is on holiday, or the chief of operations is traveling and we can't reach him. Well, you need in your plan some indication of who's allowed to take over decision making, or where the decisions default to then, because you can't wait. And Southwest's internal communications failed, tremendously. There was no answers for any of the passengers, but there wasn't either for any of the crew, right? They must have been equally so frustrated. So then the next element in the plan should be IT and data recovery. There's lots of good stuff out there. We talked about cybersecurity recently on this podcast. There is a lot you can do. There's a lot of tools available. But yeah, having a look at where your tech is outdated and where your data is stored is important. So, for instance, I work. I'm in the board of a credit union in New Orleans, and so this is hurricane territory. And so, for all these banks and credit unions in this area, if they store their data on premises, right? Well, these days it's clouds, but where does that sit? And do you then have space somewhere else that if a hurricane would hit New Orleans, it's unlikely that other location would be hit too, right? Is that far enough away that it wouldn't conflict? And do you have that backup? Then I want to talk about vendor and interface continuity. Do you have key suppliers, or are you a key supplier to anyone? What happens if you go dark? Who is impacted by this? Or what if somebody who supplies to you goes dark, right? So in this case, Southwest, of course, initially was affected by the same thing everybody was affected by, namely that the airport shut down and that there was a whole ground stop. But then that should have kicked off processes on their end to say, okay, how are we now going to deal with that situation? And it didn't really look as if anything was moving, right? In those situations, do you have the setup with the airports to ensure that your passengers can get food, can get hotel rooms, can be communicated with if you do not have enough people on the ground? Then the plan should provide training and awareness, or describe how that happens. So how does your team get educated on the elements of the plan and how these things play out? How do they know in the moment where to go? If they only going to start looking into the plan after or at the moment something happens, it's bound to not be very effective, right? So what is it that you want these people to know beforehand so that they can actually put the plan to work when things happen? And clearly, the Southwest staff also did not know what to do or what protocols to tap into. And then the last element is plan maintenance. Your plan needs to stay alive. And you need to stress test it, right? What's in there, if that's been written 10 years ago, it's probably very outdated, particularly in the data and the IT space, but also in any kind of systems and integration, in anything that involves people in positions, etc. These things change so frequently these days that you need to keep your plan updated or have it have sensible provisions that don't change when the name in a certain box changes, right? So you can also be a little smart with how you set certain things up. So these are probably the elements that you've heard of or that you've seen in a business continuity plan. I think that in this crazy world where we need more business resilience than ever, there is actually more that goes into a business continuity plan. And that also brings me back to the point that I made at the start, is that I think there is so much value in actually going through the motions of making a business continuity plan, because no, you cannot cater to every scenario, but having worked through quite a lot of scenarios will allow you to have thought and talked and communicated and planned for more eventualities than if you don't. And so then when something happens, it's almost like you have a larger toolkit to tap into with things that you have talked and spoken about that are not the same, but maybe similar enough or usable in this new situation. So we need more backups and we need more emergency exits. And that Southwest meltdown is a great example of why. So what are the additional things that your business continuity plan should include? Well, I think it needs a good reminder that humans come first and systems come second. You know that my experience is in oil and gas. And so if there is an incident in a chemical plant or on an offshore oil platform or on a drilling rig, or there's a fire in a house, everybody understands that human safety comes first. And somehow, when it doesn't involve that kind of immediate fire, chemicals, disaster, we kind of forget that people come first. The Southwest ground staff probably slept on the airport floors just like their customers, right? Their customer service agents must have had a hellish time um, dealing with that volume of complaints and having absolutely no answers and very little backing from the corporate office. Can you imagine being a flight crew from Southwest who also couldn't get access to a hotel because everything was full and your company was a mess, and then needing to stay with nearby upset passengers and dealing with those situations? That is a lot. So that's maybe not a scenario that you would have foreseen, but do you talk to your crews and to your customer service agents and stuff about checking in on peers so that if somebody really is not dealing with that situation, instead of keeping them there because you don't have somebody, removing them from that situation for their safety and for how they are treating the passengers, and putting somebody else there who maybe also doesn't have any answers and maybe isn't even from the airline, but who can at least note down names, note down issues, or help with other practical admin and cater to the situation because they still have a clear head. Safety comes first. Care for each other, making sure that everybody is in a safe space before you look at anything else. Then your business continuity plan needs to talk about how are you on an ongoing basis going to look at signals from your organization. And we've had some recent episodes about this too in the podcast. But in the Southwest case, there must have been so many signals with disruptions, maybe that were one airport and not a gazillion airports all at the same time, with a smaller footprint, or that were disruptions for slightly different reasons and not weather. There must have been so many cases before where the inability from Southwest to quickly reroute planes and put the right planes and the right crews back in the right places costed a lot of time and effort and pain. And the crews will have noted that and will have talked about it and griped about it. This signal must have been made so many times, but nothing happened with it. So how do you build something in your organizational structure that allows for these signals to actually come up, these soft data triggers? Because that's going to be your savior, right? Then we talked a little bit about it because although communication and escalation typically, to a little extent, gets addressed in the most conventional business continuity plan. So there's usually some clarity about who's on site and going to interface with emergency services, or who's maybe second in command, or who can make certain decisions. I think you need a much more agile setup. There's also too many companies who believe that the decision-making framework they have, which is to support steady state and continuous business operation, is going to also work for them in the new situation. And that's not necessarily the case. So do you want to have a think about how, when something big happens, you create a more nimble disaster action team or group? How do you set up maybe such that when an incident happens, or there is, this major hurricanes or something else, that you get a representative from all departments in a team on a phone, who are from that point onwards they're gonna be maybe nominated by their team or their team lead. So they're gonna look at who's available, and then they are going to be part of that team. So leave the rest of their job, and all they're going to work on is saying, okay, how do we keep the business moving, or how do we deal with the next 24 hours and then the 48 hours after, jointly, also allowing you to make sure that you're not forgetting about bits and pieces of the business that you are not normally involved with or aware of. And you have some completeness therein. So thinking about creating that setup that will allow you to pull a team, an action team of some sorts together quickly, is something that you, for instance, see in disaster response by FEMA and the Red Cross. They have that ability to put little action-oriented teams in very quickly because they know where to pull these people from. That's what I think you should also have a look at in your plan. Then I think you should do some scenario gamification. So not just look at risk. In my experience, people kind of start to laugh when the scenarios get kind of crazy. But you can imagine that there's businesses that talked about, what do we do if there's a pandemic? And probably 90% of the people before COVID would have gone like, yeah, we don't need a plan for that. Now we all believe that that's at least an eventuality we should plan for, but there's so much more out there. I'm not saying you need to do all the pie in the sky scenarios. What I do say is that I think you should evaluate a set of scenarios that is what we call collectively exhaustive and mutually exclusive. So they need to be different enough from one another, but collectively cover a wide spectrum. And then just make a fun day out of it, right? Work through it with a broad team, with with all the different departments of your business, so that you make sure that you've got all these elements represented in there, and then work through those, because that's where the value comes in. That there is things and teams that realize that they have connections on certain subjects that in a crisis that they don't normally have. So saying if scenario A plays out, suddenly these two teams would need to deal with each other all the time over this issue, but they don't normally work with each other. There is all these little things that creep out of the woodwork, and that actually potentially, well, not potentially because I've seen it happen, typically actually already help with resilience in your business today. It's a good way to build some connections and bridges that you maybe should have but don't have. It creates a certain level of redundancy in your system by making some of these connections and awareness between what happens in the different departments. And it can be quite fun to work through these scenarios. But it does mean that when something happens, even if it doesn't fit exactly one of these scenarios, there's typically a bunch of it that you have covered in these conversations. So you can pull that and just need to make up what goes in the gaps to make it work. Which brings me to the last point of what I believe that you should also have in your business continuity plan, which is identify what pre-investment in help you need to do. Because if you wait till something happens to find, for instance, a PR company or legal support because where the issue went is entirely outside of the remit of your in-house legal counsel, or if you, in the scenario, urgently need interim talent or additional people or bodies or alternative sourcing or transport or anything like it, you would want to pre-invest. Do you know where it would come from? If you have a PR company and you approach them and say, I don't necessarily have work today, but I want to put you on retainer so that when something happens, I can talk to you. And hence I want you to learn a little bit about my business. That's not a big fee because most PR companies would happily help that for you and help you there and even give you some advice on things that in that conversation, they note that you can do in advance. I think those pre-investments are well worth it because they so much increase the speed at which you're willing or are able to respond when the situation arises. So Southwest was super slow to respond both publicly and internally, and their PR damage was amplified by silence and clumsy messaging. I don't think they had good relationships with the other airlines or with the various airports to actually make something work between the crews and the planes and the etc. And so, yeah, when they started to finally maybe call for help, where could they turn? Because everybody else was up and running. And so the passengers just left them for other airlines and alternate solutions and never came back. So whatever alternatives they set up, majority of it didn't even get used in the end. In conclusion, disruption is inevitable. And we talk about that all the time, right? The next business storm is coming. And the only question is whether you're ready or you're going to be left scrambling. I'm not saying that you can ever be ready for everything, but I do think in putting some basic work into a business continuity plan, you can build your resilience. you have more tools in your toolkit to respond when stuff happens, and you have a much, much, much better chance to actually come out of the other side with still a business in place. If you need help updating your current business continuity plan, or actually developing one, want some help in gaming the different scenarios and having a think about how wide and how far you should look, and build that resilience muscle in your company and that readiness to respond, you know where to find me. I'm here. I can help you. Thanks for listening. I'm Maartje van Krieken, and you've been in the Business Emergency Room. And I hope to have you back here some next episodes. Thank you. That's it for this episode of the Business Emergency Room. If you are currently dealing with chaos or disruption in your business, please reach out. You can email, text, or call, and I will find a way to connect with you within 24 hours. I've helped others steer out of the storm, and I know I can help you too. Talk soon. Please like, subscribe, and share.